Hello and welcome to Checking the Vitals, a podcast powered by Specialty Care. I'm Todd Schlosser, and joining me today is Dr. Thomas Gruber, a board-certified neurosurgeon in Paducah, Kentucky at Baptist Health. In this conversation, we discuss how the democratization of technologies is making patient care better and how his passion for helping patients with glioblastomas has led him to write a patient's guide for the illness. Enjoy the conversation. So, Dr. Gruber, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on Checking the Vitals. I really appreciate it.
Happy to be here, Todd. Thank you for asking me.
Absolutely. So I'd like to start out with a very similar question to our surgeons, and that is, what was it that made you want to work in healthcare to begin with?
So I've been practicing here in Kentucky for about 11 years, and all in told, I started medical school in 2001. So I was graduated from college, and then I went on active duty in the Army, just as a rifle platoon leader in the infantry. So I didn't have any medical experience.
Oh, wow.
For my first career. And I did that for about 5 years. And then my obligation was over. And my wife and I decided that wasn't, quite the way we wanted to live our life and raise our family and all that.
Sure.
So she graciously allowed me to go back to school. And luckily I got into medical school. And that was something I always kind of had in the back of my head. Honestly, I just thought it was too difficult and wasn't sure I had what it took to get into it.
Sure.
Plus, at the end of 4 years of college, I'd had enough of school. I wasn't interested in studying anymore. So that's when I went on active duty in the Army.
Yeah. If you don't mind me asking, what did you get your undergrad in before you enlisted?
So my undergraduate is in International Strategic Studies in Russian language.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And I had an ROTC scholarship. Then they paid for undergraduate. And then so I had to fulfill that obligation once I graduated.
Yeah. And then once you graduated and fulfilled that obligation with your 5 years of service, and thank you so much for that. And believe me, I understand that maybe this isn't the way we want to live the rest of our lives and raise a family as the son of a lieutenant colonel in the Army. We moved around a lot as a kid, right? So, and when he retired, we retired to one city and stayed there, right? So that I think is completely understandable. So how did you make that transition from Army to med school? I'd imagine culturally it's a very big shift.
It was, I think I moved 4 times in 3 years, which is about par for the course, to be honest with you. And our last duty station was way up in Fort Drum, New York. So we were buried in snow. And we did some time in the South, so we knew what the warm weather looked like also. I'm fortunate to have a very supportive wife who understands the importance of what I wanted to do and knew I was committed to it. We moved back I'm originally from Buffalo, New York, so we moved back to Buffalo, New York to do all that, which certainly made the transition a lot easier because we were surrounded by, her family and my family, and we had a lot of support there to kind of get through the process, and that made life a lot easier. Yeah,
I'd imagine, especially for med school, at least. And I know you had to do residency as well, but you can sort of choose where you want to do your residency. Sometimes it's a match process, so you don't always get your first pick, right? So how did you decide, or how did you matriculate to where you went to residency? And am I correct in assuming you went into a neurosurgical residency after med school? Yeah. So again, we were lucky that I worked very closely with the Department of Neurosurgery in Buffalo, and I ended up staying there for my residency. Awesome. It was a really good program. It was a really good department that did very good training. Part of that decision was, a wife and a family, and what's the least disruptive to everything, and still get where you need to go. So that had a lot to do with why we did it that way, because we had a lot of stability, and it was only going to get harder from a time management point of view and a family life point of view in residency. But certainly being close to Buffalo, and my wife had a job and everybody was in school, it made it a lot easier. Yeah. I mean, when you had that support system of, both families being from Buffalo to help out, that makes complete sense. So do you mind if I ask why you, or how you came to the decision of neurosurgery is where I want to spend the rest of my life? How did you focus on that fellowship?
I pretty much was sure I wanted to be a surgeon when I started. And I'd read a couple of books. One was called When the Air Hits Your Brain by Scott Vertosik, which was about, trials and tribulations of being a neurosurgeon. It was very well written. And that made it sound very attractive and challenging. But in between, after my first year of medical school in the summer, I did a research program at Roswell Park Cancer Center, and you had to pick 3 areas that you were interested in. And one of them, the ones I picked, was neurosurgery. And I got randomized into it. I could have gone to the other 2.
Sure.
But then I got involved with the head of neurosurgery there, a guy named Robert Fenstermaker. And we ended up doing several research projects together. That carried on beyond that summer. And we worked on throughout medical school. So that's kind of how I fell into that niche. And they were very good to me and took real good care of me and, made me want to do it and made me want to be like them, so to speak.
Yeah. So when you dedicate so much time to one specialty or specialty, like neurosurgery, and I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but neurosurgery, I think, is the longest residency program for surgeons.
7 years now.
Yeah. And I've heard that some programs even do an 8th year because they, in the middle of it, do a research year. So it can be even longer, although I understand that not all fellowships require that or have that built in. But when you do finish your fellowship and you are able to practice on your own, how did you end up in Paducah, Kentucky? From New York to Kentucky seems like a pretty big jump as far as travel wise, where you were to where you are now.
Well, we didn't have a ton of opportunities in Buffalo as far as long-term employment. It's just a big city with a lot of neurosurgeons. Yeah. A lot of people end up staying there. And what we were looking for at the time wasn't available to us. Plus, we had lived in the South, and we had lived in warm weather and skipped a few Buffalo winters and realized what that felt like. And decided this is okay for a little while, but geez, if we're going to make another move, then maybe we should drift south. So we started to look for jobs in the South. Yeah. And a headhunter found this hospital and this system. And it was a good hospital and a good situation. The neurosurgeon that was here before me was the only one in the western half of the state at that time. Oh, wow. And, he was an older guy. He had been practicing 38 years when I got here, or something like that. Oh, wow. So, you can imagine he was not on the cutting edge of a lot of the technologies and techniques and, towards the end of his career. So I was allowed to come in and set up my own shop with him mentoring me. But after that, I could do anything I wanted to do. Any direction I wanted to take the job. They were happy to support me and let me grow it the way I wanted to grow it. And that's a very, unusual opportunity for a lot of guys coming out of school. If I'd stayed in Buffalo and I'd stayed with the department, I would have gotten pigeonholed into one little critical area of neurosurgery, and I would have been very one-dimensional probably in the care that I provided. So this was a lot more what we were looking for.
Yeah. And I've talked to a lot of neurosurgeons who have done sort of both routes. And it seems like, honestly, there are more that do sort of get pigeonholed into, I'm really good at like stroke surgeries, or I'm really good at, scoliosis surgeries, which are, both brain and back. And I think a lot of people who aren't necessarily working in the hospital every day, when they hear like, oh, I'm a neurosurgeon, they assume it's all brain and don't realize that it's also spine as well. There's a lot that goes into that. It's not just, your head, it's also your head and back. So it sounds to me like you didn't want to focus on just one small subset of the neurosurgical practice. You wanted to be able to get your hands in sort of everything. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. We say pigeonhole like it's a bad thing, but there's very good reasons why there are uber specialists out there that carve these incredible niches for themselves and become absolute experts. But no, there's a lot about this job that I liked, and the thought of walking away from certain aspects of it didn't really appeal to me. And I thought I had a good enough and a broad enough training foundation where I could still be, effective and competent and keep up to date with everything, with a wider variety of services to offer.
Yeah. Well, and you got a mentor as you moved into that job in Paducah, where he had been in the game for almost 40 years. So a very, very well practiced person who you're sort of mentoring under. I do want to ask a few questions about sort of the innovation that may have happened in that doctor's time frame as a practice. So if you're practicing for 40 years, neurosurgical techniques, technology will change drastically. And and I'd imagine, and of course, this will happen to you too over the course of your career. So what kind of things had changed from the time he started practicing to when you got the job? Like, what are some things that you noticed coming in?
So I tell people about my old partner. I say he practiced neurosurgery so long he forgot more about neurosurgery than I'll know.
Yeah.
And he started practicing in 1973, and he was one of the last neurosurgeons in Vietnam.
Oh wow! Okay.
And he was overseas and then was in Japan for a little while. And he was in the Navy.
Okay.
And then he came back. He's from Kentucky originally, but then settled in Western Kentucky. And the first large neurosurgical society meeting that he went to was in Montreal back in like 74 or 75. And that was the first international introduction of the CAT scanner to neurosurgeons.
Wow. Okay.
So he started practicing before CAT scans, which is, it's Stone Age.
Yeah.
As far as we're concerned, when it comes to technology and how we do our job now.
Yeah.
He tells this lovely story about he sat there in this great big meeting hall in Montreal, and all these guys from all over the world spent 2 days arguing about what they were going to call it.
To be in the room when that happened at that time must have been amazing. Because the CAT scan, of course, we've had X-rays before CAT scans, but the CAT scan, from what I understand, was the first time you could really get an in-depth look at what's going on inside the skull without going in it.
Well, and the rest of the body for that matter. But it's a funny thing. It's in hindsight, it's amazing to think that you were there, but at the time you didn't know what you were witnessing, right?
Yeah.
You're sure this was a great toy and something that's going to probably change the way we practice, but you don't realize, there's only a handful of true paradigm shifts in most medical specialties. And that was absolutely, he was absolutely a witness to one of them, which is amazing because, as much as I see technology change, I'm probably not going to experience something like that.
Well, nothing that pivotal, I think.
Nothing that pivotal. It only happens to a handful of people. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I'd imagine when you were going through your residency, robotics were coming on the scene in neurosurgery, navigation was coming on in neurosurgery. So you probably got sort of hands-on training with these systems in your residency. Is that the case?
Yeah. So if we're going to, kind of talk about pivot points, CAT scan is one huge innovation. Yeah. MRI scan was another huge innovation because the difference in detail of information that an MRI scan gives you. And MRI had way more profound effect on brain and spine than it did on the rest of the body. And then after that, a big innovation was the surgical microscope. Before that, there are limits of what human eyes could see in some of the pathology that we were trying to treat is in the order of millimeters in size. So the surgical microscope allowed us to get to places in the brain that we never would have been able to get to before. And then surgical navigation, when I started in residency, surgical navigation for the brain was becoming the standard of care. And there was still some places that thought it was too far beyond them and still trying to do their jobs without it, which is, insane right now that you would ever do any of this work without navigation. Yeah. And navigation, for those of you that don't understand, it's like GPS for your brain. So, we take a picture of your brain, whether an MRI or a CAT scan, and sometimes we fuse those pictures together and then we put them on the wall in the operating room in a jumbotron. And then we've got instruments like a pen that are tracked by a computer. And then I can point to something in your brain. I can look up on the MRI and it tells me exactly where I am. And that allows us to really sneak into tight places without disturbing the normal brain or normal spinal structures, and then get incredibly accurate with what we're trying to do and where we're trying to do it. And then you mentioned the other thing that is just starting to break through in neurosurgery is robotics.
Yeah.
And, we have a robotics program where I work for spine. We use the Mazor robot, which is made by Medtronic. Mm-hmm. And this weekend, I just got back from a robot meeting in Texas. But that's slowly being adopted by a lot of the more sophisticated centers that are doing very complicated spine surgery. And, that's going to be like all these other things we're talking about, in a few years, if you're not having your back done with the aid of robotic guidance, you're going to be doing it wrong. It's not there yet, but that's where that's headed to.
Yeah, it seems like everything that I've seen, all the doctors that I've talked to, it really does seem like the standard of care is going in that direction, where that will be sort of the standard of care soon.
It is, and the robotics have changed the way, the internet has changed. Before 2010, when there were no iPhones and no smartphones, and you think about we've had more technological advances in the last 12 years, than we had in the 100 before that.
Yeah.
And it's a function of processing power and computer power and, battery life and all that stuff. And, that you see that technology translating through everything in your phone, to your car, to your television. So, it's only natural it's going to start popping up in operating rooms also.
And I do think, as you sort of mentioned, in the past 10 years, the rate of technology that has sort of scaled through medicine is only going to get faster and faster and faster. So you're going to have to, as a surgeon, sort of continue your education. And I realize you guys have like CTE credits or, continuing education credits that you guys have to do and things like that. But, when there are new navigation systems or new robots or new things out there for that kind of stuff, how do you reach out and say, hey, I want to learn how to do this? Is there a system in place for like signing up for a specific type of new technology or technique or system?
So I'll give you an example, two examples. One is robotics and spine. So when I first started doing spine surgery, when I got here, we were doing it the way they had done it. They developed those techniques basically in the late 90s. And then we got navigation for spine, which is just like navigation for brain, where you're using a CAT scan or an MRI to guide you where you need to go to perform very precise work. But that had limitations. It was a huge advance over what we were doing, but there was, somebody decided that there were better ways to do it. But you go to national meetings and you talk to your friends and you see what other centers are doing that have resources that you don't have to adopt this technology earlier than kind of a lot of standard centers. And then you have to convince yourself that it's useful and doable, and then you can get involved in it. Then robotics was the same way. Robotics started to really poke its head out in around 2016, 2017. But then it's gradually gotten adopted by the leaders in the industry. And that's where everybody turns to look to see what they're doing and how they're doing it and why are they doing it that way. Then it starts to convince the larger population that it needs to be part of what you do.
Yeah, it does seem, at least with the people I've talked to in your position, that there are, I don't know if early adopters is the right word, but when new technologies come out, there are a few early adopters that then they sort of publish sort of white papers or even just talk amongst their surgeon friends that are like, hey, this one thing has greatly improved patient outcomes or whatever it's trying to solve for, right? And it seems like once that happens, it then starts to matriculate through other surgeons who may have been focusing on other things, in their practice. And then that sort of becomes standard of care across the industry for whatever surgery you're doing. And I realize that in any given month, you're doing a good, vast, different number of surgeries. I mean, you could do a glioblastoma, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, sort of things with the brain, or you could be correcting someone's scoliosis, or, there's a wide swath of different types of surgical techniques and technologies that you could be using day to day. But I think it's interesting the way it sort of matriculates through surgeons.
It does. I'll give you another good example. This week, this is a little bit of a different one. But there's a way of visualizing glioblastoma called where you use a medication called 5-ALA, aminolevulonic acid. And the patient drinks this stuff. And then what it does is it preferentially is taken up by the brain tumor. Yeah. And then when you visualize it through a series of lights and filters, the brain tumor turns pink and the surrounding brain stays blue. So you can see where the tumor is in relation to the brain around it. And it gets very important because when you kind of get to the end of taking out one of these brain tumors, it starts to become difficult to decide where does the tumor end and where does the brain begin.
Like differentiate between the two?
Right. So, there becomes this gray zone, if you will, where am I looking at normal brain or is there still tumor there? And again, it's a limitation of the microscope. But by allowing the tumor to phosphoresce with this material, you get much clearer demarcations of tumor takes up the pink, the normal brain doesn't, it stays blue. So it allows you to push it a little further down the road and debulk more tumor that you otherwise wouldn't have seen. So anyway, this technology has been FDA approved for a few years. And before, until recently, you needed a very sophisticated microscope to do this. So it had special attachments, special lights, and special filters. And, this microscope brand new is, in some instances, it's $700,000. It's an enormous capital expense to do this. And the technology is valid and it does make brain tumor surgery better. But, I got a message on social media from a guy at Cornell a couple of weeks ago that a company has developed a headlamp and a set of glasses that does the same thing as the microscope for $10,000. So, and that's a huge, if this is a valid technology that allows me to do what a $700,000 microscope does, well, now you're going to start putting this incredibly powerful tumor tool into the hands of some very reasonable community neurosurgery centers instead of it being locked up in an ivory tower at, Cornell and Harvard and places like that.
Yeah.
The headlamp has only been available and certified by the FDA for about 9 months. And all they're doing is demoing it now. So to be able to get this in your hands and use it is really leaning forward. So,
and I'd imagine that, like you were mentioning, big hospital systems like Vanderbilt here in town probably has one of those $700,000 microscopes. But rural hospitals in smaller cities, sort of in rural areas, probably can't afford all that. And a $10,000 price tag versus a $700,000 price tag is the $10,000 price tag is much more attainable for those rural health systems. And then that, because of that democratization of this technique, raises patient care literally all around the country.
Yeah, that's a great word.
Much faster. Which that's one of the reasons I love talking about innovation in the medical space, just because the implications of that are huge. Like, and I really want to talk about the glioblastomas with you specifically. And since we're talking about this technique, we may as well lean into that. The implications of people who get glioblastomas and, what happens to them over the course of their remaining life. Like we are, and when I say we, I really mean the people in your position are changing the game for those people, literally. Changing patient outcomes in very profound ways. So I really wanted to talk to you because you mentioned that you were in the stages of writing a book that's a patient guide to glioblastomas.
Right.
And I really want to know, first off, I want to sort of high level talk about why glioblastomas and what was it about that interested you enough to really focus on it like this?
So just to explain what we're talking about here, glioblastoma is a type of brain cancer. So it's what we call a primary brain tumor, which means in broad terms, there's primary brain tumors, which are brain tumors that start in the brain, stay in the brain. They don't go anywhere else. Some of them are cancerous. Some of them are not cancerous. And then there are what are secondary brain tumors, which means that you've got lung cancer, you've got colon cancer, and it has now spread to your brain. So a glioblastoma is a primary brain tumor. You don't have cancer anywhere else. You just have cancer in your brain. And, you talk about my old partner there who, did this for over 40 years. One of the first things he told me when I got here was, we did a glioblastoma together, and he said, I started this in 1973, and we're almost no better at this than we were when I started it. So it's a disease that we've spent hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars trying to do better. And it's very, very difficult and very, very frustrating to treat. And the survivals, we've nudged the survival ahead over the years is all we've done. Compared to things like breast cancer and colon cancer, where we've developed all these screening tools and early detection, and these people are living forever. And sometimes in some instances now it's just considered a chronic disease and they live normal lifespans. Glioblastoma has not seen that type of progress despite a tremendous amount of effort. And these people are victims. They know from the day they get diagnosed, while we can keep them alive and improve their survival, we're going to lose this battle eventually. And we lose it relatively quickly in the world of cancer. Somewhere around 50% of glioblastomas, despite optimal treatment, will succumb to this disease in a year or so. 90%, despite optimal treatment, will succumb in 2 or 3 years. So it's not one of the things we're super good at. But it's something that we have to wrestle with, and we have to deal with, and we have to keep fighting for it. So, that's why I chose it. That's why I focused on it, and it's always been something that has interested me. And the reason we chose to kind of do the book was, you get these patients and you get their families, and you give them their diagnosis, and then you start this journey or this process with them towards treating this disease. And over the course of 2 years that you're with them, let's just say, or 3 years or however long, they fight through it. At certain points, you end up having the same conversations with these families over and over and over again, because they get to the same junctions in the road and they get to the same inflection points. And you get to a point where you have to analyze the same situations and make the same decisions. While every patient's experience is different, there are certain aspects of it that you're going to get to this point in the road eventually. So that was the idea of the guide. It seemed like there was a program here we could build and a guide we could build to help shepherd them through this process so that they had the most amount of information they could have going forward.
Yeah. And I do want to point out that, and we may have mentioned this before, but it is a patient's guide to glioblastomas. It's very written for the patient, correct? It's not necessarily for other surgeons.
No, this isn't for doctors. It's for patients, their families, their loved ones, or the other people that might be interested in it. There's a lot of patient advocacy groups. There's a lot of patient navigators in these cancer centers. So kind of lay people that help you shepherd through these processes, not necessarily medical experts. That would also be a reasonable audience for what we're trying to build.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you don't mind, can you take us through some of these inflection points that you sort of point out in the book, sort of high level, that someone with a glioblastoma or a family member, might run into as they're running through their diagnosis?
So the first inflection point is going to be, you had to have your head scanned for some reason, whether it was a headache that no one could explain, or you had a seizure, or you were taken to the emergency room because you started to develop symptoms that made you think you were having a stroke. So, everybody's story starts with, why did you have to get your head scanned? Usually a CT scan is what's done first because it's fast and it's easy and it's cost-effective way to screen people, whether it's as an outpatient or, through an emergency room. And that gives you enough information, not to tell you what's going on, but it gives you enough information to know you need to know more. And then that usually leads to an MRI, which usually gives you a sense that you've got a tumor of some sort, but it certainly doesn't give you enough information to tell you, what exactly is going on. Then the decision after that is, do you need surgery? Yes or no? Because we have to figure out what this is. Otherwise, we won't know how to treat it. So a lot of people after that, because they've got some sort of neurologic problem that led them to this, end up having surgery either to remove the tumor in its entirety or at least to biopsy it. So that's that's kind of the first conversation you have to have with people when they show up in your hospital in the first 24 to 48 hours, that you're suspecting that there's a problem.
And I'd imagine that, and correct me if I'm wrong, obviously, but I'd imagine that surgery is an option for a lot of people, but it's not always an option.
Right.
It depends on the location, right?
So the biggest bullet in the gun we have to treat this disease is surgery.
Yeah.
If you take surgery out of the mix, people do much, much worse with the treatments. So we always want to be able to find a way to safely remove as much of this tumor as we can. But we talk about the brain. The best analogy I heard about it is real estate. There's some high priced real estate in the brain that we can't go in with surgery. And if you have a tumor that occurs in certain areas, the real estate price is too high, and we're going to badly hurt you trying to fix you.
Yeah.
And then there are other parts of the brain that we call our optional equipment. It's nice to have it. You'll do better if it's there, but you know what? You don't really need it to live, like, power windows.
Yeah.
And then those parts of the brain, we can get very, very aggressive with surgery, and patients do exceedingly well. So location is really important. But some people, we look at them and say, we'll do a biopsy and we'll get a diagnosis, but we may not be able to help you beyond that.
I'd imagine those conversations are very, very difficult to have. I'd imagine that you touch on them in the book as well, because that's got to come up in the patient journey, right? I mean. Yeah,
it does. And then some people, even without surgery, will go on to try to get chemotherapy and radiation.
Sure.
But again, we're fighting with one arm tied behind our back for glioblastoma when it comes to that. But and there are some other very innovative technologies that they're working on for people with glioblastoma that can't have surgery. And those, again, are very expensive, and they're not available in all centers. One of them is a laser interstitial thermal therapy, or LIT, where they insert a probe into the center of the tumor, and the tumor is always in a place where that's unreachable with a regular conventional operation.
Yeah.
And then they thermo destroy the surrounding tissue, which is the tumor, with a heat and light source. When I have patients that need this, I have to send them to St. Louis. They end up going 200 miles away to get this treatment. But even then, that's better than doing nothing.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's hard to deal with patients that you can't help, especially when the diagnosis is ultimately going to be a fatal diagnosis if you don't do anything.
Yeah. I'd imagine you got into this line of work because you want to help people. You want to, help fix them. And it's got to be both frustrating and, hard to deal with when there's not a whole lot we can do for certain people. But what are some other inflection points that they will hit along that sort of patient journey as you sort of provide that standard of care for glioblastomas?
So in the first encounter, if we get you to an operating room and we can get that tumor out safely and as completely as we can, then you go on to get chemotherapy and radiation, and then hopefully things are under control for several months or even longer after that. Mm-hmm. And then the next big inflection point is going to occur in that patient's care when the tumor recurs. And we always tell people up front, when we give them the diagnosis, that we do have effective ways to treat this, and you're strong enough to tolerate it, and we'll get you through the treatments. But for 99% of people, there's going to come a point where this is going to come back, and then the question is, the next inflection is point. Okay, we think it's come back. What do we do now?
Yeah.
Is there more surgery? Is there other chemo? Is radiation an option after that? Are there other non-standard treatments? So that's the next big conversation that has to occur down the road when it happens.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just thinking through conversations I had with when my dad had a stroke, and we had sort of similar conversations with a neurosurgeon here in town. And there was just not much they could do because of the location of where the bleed was, right?
Yeah.
And that's, I remember that conversation. Those are one of the pivotal moments in my life, right? So I'd imagine that as a doctor, you have those conversations way more than I'll have to have those conversations,
Yeah. I mean, weekly, right?
Yeah. I mean, well, as often as it comes up, right? So how do you process through that? I'd imagine that you can't just disconnect from it altogether.
No, you can't. And it gets harder as I get older. I can tell you that. But I think it does take a certain temperament to do this and make it a regular part of your life. It's not dealing with these types of patients and this type of diagnosis as a regular part of your profession is not for everybody. And if you don't have the right temperament for it, obviously you should find yourself in another niche of neurosurgery.
Yeah.
But dealing with cancer patients is so rewarding. They're by far the most gracious and grateful and satisfied with your care patients that you'll run into. And I think it's easy to care for them because they're, for the most part, they're victims of a genetically bad lottery for a lot of people. You can sit there and say, well, they were smokers, or they did this or they did that. But, not every smoker gets cancer. And there's plenty of non-smokers that we see that get lung cancer too.
Yeah.
So, while certainly you can do things in your life to not help your chances, these people are all victims, and they're in a desperate situation when they get to you. And it's very, very, I think that makes it very easy to care for them. And it makes it very satisfying to care for them. Even if sometimes the ultimate outcome isn't what you hope for.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like once you have that diagnosis, it's really about prolonging the inevitable.
Yes.
Not, succumbing to it, sort of fighting against it in whatever ways you can, whatever options you have. And of course you can give them that, but if someone doesn't have access to you, they can look at this patient guide that you and I believe you said there was a team of people working on this patient guide.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd imagine it'll walk them through that from a patient perspective, obviously, of what options they have.
Yeah, what options they have, because you have to understand that there are some things like the laser interstitial therapy that isn't available where I am. So I've got people I can collaborate with. There are the other thing that the book talks about too is the importance of second opinions, and there are a good percentage of these people that get to a point in the disease where you run out of standard care, and but they still want to get treatment that's available. So now you're talking about the world of experimental treatments and experimental protocols. And there's no guidebook for that. That is a very, that's a world and a process that's incredibly hard to organize from a patient care point of view. Because, you've got 25 clinical trials at Vanderbilt, you've got 25 clinical trials at MD Anderson, you've got 15 more at Duke, and they're all moving in different directions, pursuing different paths. And it's impossible for one practitioner to understand everything that's going on out there.
Yeah.
So, again, we're just trying to provide the patient and their families the tools so that when they go in to talk to their doctors, they've got the knowledge where they can ask the intelligent questions, and they can go home from their doctor's appointment, look through the book, and start to process some of this information. Because, when we sit down, the kind of rule that we go with, if I sit down with a patient and their spouse and two of their kids, once I tell them they have a glioblastoma, half of the people in the room stop listening to me.
Yeah, it's probably a form of shock that they go into.
It is, and their brains shut off, and they lose their focus and attention, and they turn inward. And I get that, and it's appropriate and it's natural. And then one person in the room will come back online and start listening to us, and another person will come back 5 minutes later after they've thought of something else. So if they leave the doctor's office, one, you don't always understand exactly what we're talking about because it is complicated and you're new to it, and you don't catch it all. Yeah. It's a long appointment. You're there for 45 minutes or an hour, and we go through a lot of stuff in these inflection point meetings, if you will. Yeah. So to go home and have a guidebook that you can reference some of the things that we talked about and go home and read it and spend more time with it is, I think, very, very useful for them. Because the alternative is they end up, and this is, totally appropriate too, but they end up calling you back and asking you to explain these things again, or, you bring it up at the next patient meeting, and which is fine. But, a lot of them are looking for a tool where they can help understand this themselves and do the legwork themselves.
Completely understand that. I mean, if it was me and you were giving me that information, I probably would shut off immediately when you gave me the diagnosis, and would have 1,000 questions, but wouldn't think to ask them, because I would literally just be in shock
for the
remainder of the appointment. And then if I was able to use this patient guide, and maybe it's just my sort of personality type, I would much rather do the research myself. But I know enough to know that you don't want to go to like WebMD and do that. So using a patient guide, something like that, that I can refer to and say, okay, I'm here in the process.
Yeah.
These are the next things. Here are the questions I really should be asking. So it'll help me focus what I need to ask instead of sort of taking a shotgun approach to it. So I'd imagine that would be super helpful, and just so many aspects of it, because it would also help me explain to my friends and family what's going on and all of that stuff that, I can't drag you around to explain to my, sister and brother, what's going on. So like, it would be very, very helpful. So do you have a trajectory or timeline as to when the book will be put out?
Hopefully before the summer. So all the first line editing is completed. The manuscript's complete. And so now we're just working on the mechanics of getting it a physical book in people's hands and getting it finished. Yeah.
Do you have a name for it? And how can they reach out to find out more information about it?
So we're building a website, probably going to be, which is going to be drthomasgruber.com. Okay. And that's going to have the early information of the book and some samples of it. Okay. And then when it becomes available for purchase, how you can purchase it, and how you can get your hands on it. Yeah. Then it's going to be, it'll be distributed through Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all that too. So you'll be able to find it through the conventional booksellers.
Sure.
Also. Yeah. There's a second book that comes out with this that's going to be a companion guide that is just not moving along as fast as the first book, because it's a little more complicated. Okay. So this is a graphic organizer for a glioblastoma patient. So it's going to be almost like a binder form, and it's going to have a place to schedule all your medical appointments between your oncologist, your neurosurgeon, and your radiation oncologist. It's going to have your chemotherapy and medication schedules, as well as all the other medications that you might be on and how they're taken. It's going to have a place to keep track of copies of all your MRIs and films that you're going to be getting. And then, of course, it's going to have notes that you can take at every doctor's appointment. Sure. What the plan going forward is at every doctor's appointment, things like that. There's things like this that exist in the world, but you can have it. You give it to grandma, just a little book that she takes to the doctors every time she has a cough or a cold or something. But they're super, super general, and they're not very specific. Yeah. So to be able to build something like this for a diagnosis is so specific, like glioblastoma, where we're only dealing with certain types of medicines, and we can spell those out very, very clearly in a definable, digestible, packet, I think is going to be a big adjunct to the original manuscript, the patient guide. Yeah, I'd imagine in tandem, they'll be great for people who are going through this. I mean, the patient and family guide for both the patient and the family, but this, the second book or booklet that you're working on, sounds like a great place for them to sort of organize their daily life, and also, keep almost like a copy of their medical record, the stuff that they need to take with them every time they go, so that they always can refer back to it. Their surgeon can refer back to it, all of that stuff in one place that they can bring with them. Yeah. Right. Because it's funny is, again, I talk about how you hit these inflection points along the road with every single family, and it's always the same kind of process they go through. Well, 3 or 4 months after you give them the diagnosis, they all show up with this giant accordion folder. Yeah. Trying to recreate what we're going to build for them. Yeah. It's funny is when we talk to the book publishers about these ideas, just coincidentally, there's 3 or 4 people in the meeting and they said, they had a patient or a family member that died of cancer. And they said, took me 6 months to build that for my mother when she was diagnosed with lung cancer. We ended up building the same thing, but we did it at Office Max by ourselves.
Yeah.
So that kind of built on itself, and we're real excited about that.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. And you're giving those people the gift of time they can spend with their loved one, as opposed to going to Office Max and building a binder that they can use for that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, this becomes a part-time job for people.
Yeah,
it becomes a part-time job for somebody in the family, whether it's the spouse or one of the children take charge. Somebody ends up being the master of the ceremonies, and somebody ends up keeping track of everything. And, when you end up having to go to, for example, if we send you to St. Louis for lit therapy or some sort of other second opinion down the road, then you've got everything all in one spot. Yeah. And you can carry that with you, and there's no hunting and pecking and waiting for faxes and, gee, I didn't get that report, and we're waiting to hear from, Kentucky and, stuff like that. Yeah.
I mean, and your life is already hard enough as it is dealing with this diagnosis, or dealing with a loved one who has this diagnosis and helping them through it, that, anything that can make that process easier has to be just such like a load being lifted off of you.
It does. And the other important thing that we think that this is going to do, both of the books, is, so many of these people are looking for, they're looking to gain some measure of control over a process that they have no control over.
Yeah.
And little tools like this, they're literally beneficial and helpful, but it gives them control over a process, and it makes them feel like they're part of the process, and it makes them feel like they are in charge of their own care and a participant, rather than just getting battered around between the doctors and just doing what everybody says. And you don't want to be a pawn in this process. You really want to be a player.
You're an active member in it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So we think that's real important too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Gruber, thank you so much for taking some time today to talk to us about glioblastomas and the books that you are writing to help with, people who are dealing with that, and just really everything else we talked about. I really appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Todd. It's a unique opportunity to kind of get this out and inform people about what we're doing and why we're doing it and why we think it's so important. This is a small group of patients, relatively speaking, compared to a lot of the cancer world. And they have trouble finding each other sometimes, and they have trouble communicating and sharing information. So I think this platform is really, really useful, and I appreciate you asking me.
Absolutely.